Hi everyone, this is the first video for flute methods and we will be talking about tone and embouchure. As with any musical instrument, we talk a lot about how tone sets the first impression in one's playing, and a direct quote here also conveys that from your handouts. The most important element in flute playing is the tone. Three elements that we want to talk about: the airspeed, the size, and the angle of the airstream. And also the five elements of physical approach to tone with flute playing. We discussed the breathing mechanism, head postural relationships, the head-body relationship, mostly dealing with embouchure placement, and the formation of that embouchure, as well as talking about tongue, a little bit of jaw-chin movement, and some ways to be able to shape the oral cavity to explore different tonal colors. Purity and clarity of tone is achieved by using what I call a laser light gun approach with the airstream. One that is constant, one that is narrow, and one that splits correctly across the opposite blow edge of the embouchure hole. And oftentimes the term that we use to describe this production of airstream is what we call an edge tone. So we're trying to strive for a homogeneous sound, one that is even and equally pure in all registers, particularly the high and the low register. Fuzziness or too much edge in the sound will draw attention away from the actual music making, and so we want to try to really avoid these two extremes. Fuzziness is oftentimes achieved by too large of an aperture size, and the real edgy, buzzy, edgy tone is by over-focusing. I'll demonstrate. The fuzzy, one that is just really much too open and too relaxed of embouchure. This is the edgy. And again, you start to just hear too much extraneous noise and not enough pure tone. Modeling a good tone for our students is of the utmost importance, and we will achieve that in our Flute Methods class this semester, I promise you. But certainly additional study through private lessons, working with a professional, that purity and clarity in one's tone can be achieved. The embouchure. The center of the lips, or the center of the embouchure hole, should be centered with the center of the bottom lip. And we want to set the inside of the embouchure hole on the pink part or edge of the bottom lip when placing the embouchure plate to the chin. And therefore the lip plate should sit low on the chin, really allowing a lot of the bottom lip to what I call ooze out over the lip plate. The general amount of coverage with the bottom lip can vary from teacher to teacher, but generally a third to about a half of the embouchure hole is covered by placing that bottom lip out over the lip plate. Some teachers teach a method called the touch and roll method, and I just wanted to draw your attention to it because it is still used today. It is a very concrete way for students to get a grasp as to how to place the embouchure plate a little more, in a more consistent way perhaps, but one of the things that this method does is it sets the embouchure plate too high on the chin, in my opinion. I'll demonstrate what this method is. You basically keep the lips closed and put the center of the embouchure hole in the center where the lips are closed. And then you roll down to achieve your placement. If I come from the bottom up and really scoop up my bottom lip and put it right on the edge of the pink part of the lip, there's a lot more flexibility that's gained by having more of that bottom lip exposed, and you can just hear the depth of the sound really, really improve. So I tend to avoid the touch and roll method with beginning students. The top lip is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of the embouchure. I call it the stabilizer. It sits on the bottom lip, and it really helps to direct the airstream and to control the airstream, particularly when you're playing at a very loud dynamic. The stability of that top lip will really help to keep that airstream very focused in the direction it needs to be. We're trying to aim the airstream toward the outer edge of the embouchure hole. So it's a very short distance, actually, if you think about it, from where it leaves the lips to where it hits the embouchure hole. It's a very short distance. That airstream is being angled about 60% of the airstream into the embouchure hole, into the flute tube, and 40% of the airstream is being aimed across and is essentially wasted. But 60% of the airstream is quite a bit of air going in. Saying the word to while keeping the corners forward. You can also experiment with the O-E combination of the German umlaut, Ü, Ü. That gives you a little bit of firmness of the corners with the E sound and the O-Ü sound with the lips coming forward. William Kincaid, the former flutist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, I love this quote. He says the embouchure is like a simultaneous stretch and pucker. Although be careful, don't stretch too much. And that brings us to the next bullet point here. When we pull the corners too far back, we tend to thin out the size of the aperture. And also avoiding the other pulling up too much, a smiling embouchure, or the frowning, pouting embouchure with the corners too far down. I basically like to use the width of the embouchure plate to measure my corners. If my corners are going too much past the embouchure plate, then I know I'm pulling too far back. So generally, keeping the corners lined up with the width of the embouchure plate is a good visual. Also keeping the size of the aperture small and maybe thinking a little bit oblonged with the aperture will help from pulling and or thinning a little on the horizontal side with your small slit there. The top and bottom lip work together in tandem to change the angle of the airstream. And we use what I call gentle chinnings to aid that airstream as well. So if I were to angle the airstream up, I would chin forward or send my bottom lip forward. If I were to angle for the low register, I would lead a little bit more with my top lip and bring my chin a little bit more retracted back. So and we can demonstrate that with various visuals, but we did a little bit of that on the Numo Pro in our first class. Use the mirror to see if the embouchure hole is shining at you. And if it is, so the embouchure hole here, if in the video you can see too much of that open embouchure hole at you, then it probably means that your student has too much of the embouchure hole uncovered and they need to place it a little bit lower on the chin, and maybe also keeping the flute perpendicular to the floor and centered up a little bit. So too much embouchure hole exposed is too uncovered. The other extreme is if you see possibly too much of the bottom or even underneath the lip plate, and that means that they are rolled in too much or too covered with the embouchure hole. Some other measurements that you can use and visual aids is to actually use the chin's grease line formed on the lip plate. After some bit of playing time, take your head joint and look to see if you can see just a little bit of a oil or grease mark, particularly if you have oily skin. And you can see, oh wow, I'm covering quite a bit of my embouchure hole. That's my tendency. But that's a good marker to see where your embouchure averages in its general coverage of the embouchure hole. Another visual, oftentimes when our building is high level of humidity, maybe a little cool and the instrument is cool, against the warm band of air that you're blowing across, we will oftentimes see a band of condensation forming on the outer side of the lip plate here. And that band can give you a lot of information. If the band is too wide, and I've seen it, almost expand off the edge of the front of the head joint here, that definitely means that your embouchure hole is way too big, or it's angled in such a way, as well as being too large, that we really need to bring, in particular, the inner part of the lip forward a little bit more to make that focus. Generally, you should see a thin band coming across the front, and maybe even one that's a bit triangular in shape. Generally, I like to say keep the flute parallel to the ground. So if you are going to slightly angle your flute down, the head and in particular the lips need to follow. If you take your head joint or your flute way down, but you don't tilt your head, or you take the flute way forward or way back behind you, you see how I'm starting to kind of come off of my lips here. And we really need all of that fleshy bottom lip in particular on the lip plate to make a nice cushion for that airstream. When breathing, try not to open up the top lip, and this will take a bit of coordination, but basically what I mean is that when you take a breath, think about dropping the chin or the jaw. And keeping the top lip stable. The other way would be, and it's where the top lip comes off of the embouchure. It just is a little more risky when the top lip has to constantly reset itself on the bottom lip. So that's something to watch when you're working with your breath, and also pre-setting, really taking the time to set that embouchure. Tilt the head back and observe the size and the shape of your embouchure, of your aperture here in the mirror. And so while you're playing, just tilt back and look at the actual size. I think you'll find a lot of information helpful there. You can also do what I call the sweet spot exercise. And this is basically where, as you're sustaining a note, you move the flute's head joint side to side, up, down, and really wait until that sound becomes much more pure. And then when you found it, just practice finding that exact spot again. It's really a lot of tactile memorization. Experimenting with different vowel sounds, yes, A, E, I, O, and U, bringing the space between the teeth at different levels of openness to color the sound. though we need to also still though be careful that we keep that size of the aperture small. So again, we're consistently working from a very focused aperture at the front of the embouchure, but experimenting internally with different oral shapes. Avoid the whistling the airstream, which we'll seen in class a number of times. And this is basically by, just producing like you would whistle. And oftentimes we might hear a little bit of sympathetic air coming through the head joint, but for the most part the tone is being produced by just whistling. So we need to really make sure that we're getting that embouchure hole or airstream directed a bit more into the embouchure hole, so we're avoiding that. Dizziness. Definitely dizziness may occur. Take breaks, sit down more, but really the most important thing that you can do to help yourself with this is to really work on a very focused, very small aperture and conserve that airstream as much as you can. Once the airstream has started too, you can really think about using your small lip muscles to kind of squeeze and release on that embouchure, on that airstream, so that you're, again, kind of controlling the amount and the speed of how much air you're moving through. And some physical things that you might have various students come to with the instrument. Certainly we're going to be analyzing all of our embouchures, as our lip makeup is all very unique. On the next page you'll just see some little drawings here, and in particular I just want to mention the teardrop aperture and the development of a side aperture. This extra fleshy part of the skin on the top lip, a lot of us have it. I always like to say, look at Tom Hanks, the actor. He has a huge tab on his top lip, and I just wonder if I could get him to play the flute. Because it's a lot of additional flesh that's going to interfere with that real direct airstream. And so usually I'll try to work with the student to thin out, and this would be a case where maybe we might think about pulling just slightly on the corners to thin out that top lip. Sometimes students just find their way, maybe do some experimenting. The sweet spot exercise works really well, and they've been keeping an ear out for just the real pure sound, and they develop what we call a side embouchure. And that tab can be pushed either to the left or to the right. And I say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it's producing a beautiful sound and there's general flexibility with the embouchure, that it's usually not a problem. And so that kind of finishes up this part of the first video. Next video will be the posture video. Thanks.